One of the more obvious changes in SKYRIM Special Edition is the fact that the graphics have been improved. Now this isn't the major draw for me because of course I'm used to playing the heavily modded Skyrim and that looks pretty damned amazing anyway. However, I have to say I've been generally quite impressed with how Special Edition looks and performs, and I thought I would discuss with you what I'd noticed and, how I feel about these graphical changes. Now this is not going to be a kind of side-by-side comparison of Skyrim and Skyrim Special Edition. I'm just generally going to be chatting and rambling about what I have noticed and basically whether or not I approve and ways in which I think it could be improved and modded. The first thing I noticed and indeed looked for were the shadows. Skyrim quite possibly had the worst shadows I have seen in a game, perhaps ever actually. I mean honestly, the Skyrim shadows are hideous. It's one of the major reasons for using something like an ENB in my opinion. I mean those shadows were almost unforgivable, and I can tell you that the Special Edition shadows are fine. They may not be the best shadows I've ever seen, but they're good enough that I didn't really notice them. You don't pay any attention to them. They don't jump out of the screen and try to kill your eyeballs as the shadows in the original game did. Lighting in general has been improved. It looks a little nicer, a little more natural, and of course you've got God rays as you can see. They're not over the top, they're not to that point where you would have to call them cinematic. They're pretty subtle but generally pretty pleasant, and I think it gives the game overall a nice effect. There is one thing that has been bothering me, and that is the shadows on small objects such as grass. It might actually be the ambient occlusion, but it does look like the normal shadows. If you look at the shadow on this little plant here, if I move away, the shadow disappears at a certain point. Let's hope. There you go. You see it? It just disappeared. And then it appears. And I'm playing at Ultra. That seems a very short distance for that to pop in and out. I have a feeling that's the sort of thing that I'm going to be looking to tweak, hopefully in the ini files. That does look like the shadow. I know the game does have ambient occlusion and it does look fairly nice, but I've never really been an expert at that sort of thing anyway. I generally notice it more when it's a shadow, and as you could see there, that shadow definitely disappears pretty close actually. I mean that's not a distant object there, is it? Generally the textures do look sharper and higher quality, but there are a few exceptions. For example, rocks. I've had a hard time putting my finger on it. I've tried describing it a few times, but the rocks just feel fake. They look almost drawn to me. I actually joked about it in a stream and said in some ways they look like Borderlands type rocks. And it's not just rocks on the ground, it's also mountains. There's something a little fake about that mountain to me. It looks a little drawn, as if someone's drawn it with pencils. A good drawing, but a drawing nevertheless. I'm not liking those textures, and so whilst I think the road for example works quite well, I'm just bothered by certain other objects. Now I am playing on PC, so this is not a big deal because we all know we're going to get a lot of texture mods pretty quickly, and I'm sure that problem will be gone. But it's a little strange that we are getting some textures that look better. I quite like the way grass looks now, but rocks, I'm just not that keen on them at all. One thing that has improved since the original game is the water. I have to say it's still not the greatest water I've ever seen, but it is a massive improvement over the original. The original game had very thick sort of oily looking water. I still think the water in Skyrim looks a little thick and a little unrealistic, and let's face it, those of us on PC and probably on Xbox One are going to be, you know, adding some new water textures that make it look a lot better. But the actual flow of the water is now a lot more realistic. You can see here that the water in this area is flowing a lot slower than the water over there. It flows in a far more realistic manner, and I think even with mods that make the textures a lot higher resolution and a lot more pleasant, the flow itself is going to help make rivers and lakes look a lot more natural. They also added dynamic depth of field to the Special Edition, and for those of you that don't know, that is where essentially it's as if you're looking through a camera and the camera is focusing on what you're looking at. As you can see here, I'm looking at this tree and the background is blurred. But if I look off to the side at the bridge or at the terrain beyond it, it all comes back into focus. Now, in Skyrim Special Edition, it doesn't seem to blur the foreground objects. If I look away from the close object, it does not seem to get blurred, which happens in a lot of depth of field mods and solutions. So it does behave a little bit differently, but generally, if you're looking for something that blurs the background when you look at a close object, that is now built in to Skyrim Special Edition by default. The effect is very snappy and responsive. It comes on and off very quickly. I would actually prefer some more options. You can change the strength of the blur, but it's basically one strength for all situations, and it doesn't matter whether you're in combat, whether you're moving, and the speed at which it blurs is the same speed at which it focuses. The mod I created, Dynavision, actually made it so that it would focus instantly, which made combat and searching for things easier, but the blur would happen a little slower, which made it feel a little less abrupt. I'm going to look into adding that via a mod. Maybe it's possible I can use the in-game depth of field and have a lot more control over the strength and responsiveness of the blur. I feel that the distant terrain is a lot better in the Special Edition. It seems to have, well, I don't know, it's difficult to say that it's got more details. It just seems to be more pleasant, less offensive. There are some places, like here, outside Whiterun, where it's still fairly bad. As you can see there, it does look bad, and you will see a lot of popping in the mid-range objects. But actually the very distant terrain doesn't look too bad, and there's very little popping on the mountains and the rocks. It tends to be grass and land that I'm noticing, and I'm sure I can probably tweak that. And as I've said, this is probably the worst area for checking out distant terrain, so which is kind of why I'm here. And I am happy to report that there is no sign of the Z fighting problem. Those horrible shimmering mountains we're all used to in Skyrim are gone. The mountains are steady. They look like mountains. No more blinking and flickering, which is great news. Skyrim Special Edition uses a different form of anti-aliasing to Skyrim, and it is a fairly efficient anti-aliasing method. It doesn't hurt your performance that much, which will help if your graphics card is weaker. However, my graphics card is not even under the slightest load when playing this game, and so I would probably prefer something like MSAA, because the anti-aliasing they're using does have a slight blur on mid to long distance textures. It's not hugely noticeable because the game does have quite a few weather hazes as well, and so you might pass it off as one of those, but people who dislike that sort of thing are going to notice it. I would have liked to have seen some other options. I can probably force it through the NVIDIA control panel, and I'm going to try and do that again, because for me, I've got graphics card power to spare, and you know, I like the effect. However, in general, I think it's pretty good. Overall, I have to say the changes made for the Special Edition have been pretty good. Some of them are excellent, like the improved shadows and the better water flow. Some of them are less impressive. For example, the texture improvements. Some places they're better, and in some other places they're not. For example, the rocks. I would say if you're going to compare vanilla Skyrim to the Special Edition, you're probably going to prefer the Special Edition, probably quite considerably. If you compare the Special Edition in its vanilla form to a heavily modded Skyrim, you probably will be disappointed. Heavily modded Skyrim still looks noticeably better, but there is no reason why we won't see an awful lot of visual mods for the Special Edition too. We don't have the same requirements to fix the ugly shadows, but I'm sure there are plenty of other things we would like to see, from texture packs to colour palette changes. We're going to see these mods over time, and my guess is because on a lot of systems we're able to run the Special Edition more stable and with better performance, you're going to be able to add more graphical mods. And so, honestly, I think we're going to see some fairly impressive setups that will actually be playable, i.e. 60 frames a second on a good system. And that is generally good news. So, my final verdict is, I generally approve. I really do. I'm happy with the changes. I love the distant terrain now. This looks so much better than it would have on my original Skyrim. Even with all the mods, to be honest, I always had problems with Z fighting. No matter what I did, it was always a bit of a problem. Now I don't. This looks really nice, actually. So there you go. Generally, a big thumbs up from me.